So we talked an awful lot about adding storage to our servers. The next step is to add tags. There is a lot to say about tags, but I'm not going to do that in this video because that gets a little bit more advanced. I'll just say that it's a great idea to add tags, and a lot of them, to your resources in AWS in general. This will help you do things like segment and report on cost for different areas of your infrastructure, different applications, different teams, all that good stuff, as well as help you find and manage dynamic environments where you need to do certain actions and even do certain auditing based on server tags. Okay, that's enough of that. What we're really going to talk about in this video is configuring security groups. A thing to know about your servers and your networking stuff is that you have to have security groups around in order to allow access to your resources, your servers, your load balancers, your databases, your caches, anything that talks to the network. They'll need a security group so that AWS has a firewall of sorts, so it knows what traffic to allow and what traffic to deny. This is a firewall, essentially. It's at the network level in AWS. It's just hidden from you. It's not something you configure on each server, but you can treat it like a firewall. All right, so we're going to create a new security group here. It's going to have a name and a description. Those don't really matter so much. Here you define what's allowed into the server. If there's no rules here, then no traffic is allowed into the server that we're creating here. Now, security groups are specific to the VPC you're in. So you can have security groups created in different VPCs and you won't see them here listed because these security groups that are here are only exist in the VPC that I've created the server in. So way back in a few settings ago, we set what VPC and what subnet the server goes into. That defines what security groups we see here. I'll just go to create a new one and we can add some options here. Now, the default rule that they show you here is to allow in a type of SSH. Now, all this dropdown does is autofill the stuff here, the protocol, the port range, and the source and all that good stuff. So this isn't doing anything special. It's just defining other options that you could edit manually otherwise here. So SSH is a TCP protocol, port 22, and the source is something that you can't change. So a custom anywhere is basically this. So IPv4 and IPv6 address equivalents for anywhere. So this makes it accessible from the public internet if your server is in a public subnet and the server itself has a public IP address. You can set it to my IP address, which just gets your IP address and sets it to something that allows. This happens to be the one for my home network here. And custom. So custom is the default it gives you, and you can do the 00s to allow it from anywhere. Okay, so if I get rid of this option, we see the hint here. We can do a CIDR range or a specific IP. So we have a CIDR address range here, which is saying all addresses, that's /0 here. This is all IP addresses allowing public network traffic into the server. It can be a specific IP address, which is what you see if you do my IP here. Actually, this is a range, but you could also do a specific IP. And you could also do a security group, which is super interesting. I could say that anything inside of, say, this security group, the default for the VPC, if I just copy and paste the address of the security group and I go back to create a new security group here, I could say any other resource that also is inside of this security group that has the security group assigned to it can SSH into the server on port 22. And that is a very interesting option to use, which is kind of neat. You can actually create security groups that just allow other security groups in. You don't have to go by IP address specifically. Now, what I often do for public servers is to allow anything, or not all public servers, but servers that act as a bastion or an entry point into your private network. So you can SSH into a server that allows SSH connections from anywhere, and from there you're in the private network, and then you can start SSHing to other servers, depending on your security setup. So this is a good default for just creating a server somewhere that's going to be accessible from the web, and you want to SSH in. There are other ways to SSH into your servers as well that don't actually require you to open it up to port 22, but that's a different video course. The other thing you can do here is set this up for allowing port 22 SSH traffic in from your private network only. So that would be something like 172.32.00, whatever your VPC IP address range is what you can set here. And then you'll only allow port 22 SSH connections, in this case, from within your VPC from that private network. In my case, we'll allow SSH traffic and HTTPS traffic and HTTP traffic. And that's going to allow port 443, port 80, and of course port 22 for SSH traffic from anywhere. So this is basically a server that is meant to be used for public web traffic. If I was creating a database instance, I would do something like this. It would probably be MySQL Aurora, so port 3306, and not from anywhere, but from my public network only. So what I tend to do, or what I've done in the past, is to not make my RDS database servers accessible from the public internet, although that's an option that you can do. Instead, I only make it accessible from within my VPC, within my private network, in which case I'm doing something like this, where it's only allowing in private network traffic from sources that are in the private network, that are in this IP address range. And of course, you can also do the trick where you only allow in traffic from port 3306 from instances that are within a certain security group. Okay, so that's enough of security groups. We use this a lot in other areas in AWS, so I'm sure I'll be covering that again. But just know that security groups in this case are allowing certain traffic into the server, right? So without any rules here, nothing can access it. So you need to say what is allowed to access into your server. This is server in my case, but it could be anything. Your RDS databases, your Elasticache cache instances, any of the managed things in AWS that speak to the network. Now, one other thing to know here is I can cancel this and go to this server, for example. That was a simplified use case that just showed inbound traffic, but your security groups also have outbound rules. So if I go to security groups, you'll see I have 2 attached to this instance. So you can have more than 1 attached to any server or resource. So if I go to SSH testing for a security group here, there's inbound rules, ingress for SSH, and there's outbound rules, and you can set outbound rules as well. By default, the outbound rules are going to allow in all traffic or allow out all traffic from your server. But often people do things like block certain ports, like ports that are used for sending emails. So to prevent email abuse, people might set an outbound rule that prevents traffic going outbound from the server over the typical SMTP ports, for example. Okay, that's all I want to say about security groups when setting up your servers. That's really the last option. After that, you're launching your instance, with the exception that there is one more thing to know about in terms of the key pairs, the SSH keys that are added to the server that allow you to SSH in.